Thanks. So welcome everyone. So we were delayed in our funding mainly because we kept on changing scopes of other projects, and so suffice to say, we are launching approximately 40 webinars once a week. So for June, we have live ones, cost estimating today and for next Thursday. And then we have another one on radon gas and one on blueprint finding. And then for July and August, we'll be recording the ones we were supposed to do in May and April, and we'll be posting those out and sending out notices. So they will be pre-recorded. Generally, they're about 30 minutes in length. And if you have any questions, you can send them to Claude or myself. And then we start up again in September with a number of topics that were identified throughout the year. We run those straight up till December. And then in January, we have a couple more, and then that's it. What we found in January to March is it's a year end for many of us, so it becomes more of a challenge for participants at that stage. So that's our webinar series, and we'll be posting everything once I get the schedule and confirmation, probably in the next few weeks. But it'd be exciting. Lots of them are new, and the ones that are repeats are similar to this. They're taking everything to the next level. So that's our webinar series, and we're looking forward to it.
Thanks, John. Thanks. Again, welcome back, everybody. And for those new ones, again, welcome aboard. Really, I wanted to talk about, this is part one of a two-part webinar session. So today's session, and then a follow-up with part two on Thursday. So really, I just want to provide another perspective on the issue of costing and estimations. So when we take a look at this, I'm really taking a look at it with my background from the point of view of estimating and costing regarding construction. So let's start with a bit of review. Before you estimate any job, really, you need to, first of all, understand the complete scope of work. Really, that boils down to what is required and what is involved. The process usually involves three basic parts: doing the takeoff or performing it, writing up an estimate, so determining the actual costs, and then summarizing it and presenting it to your client. In this case, the client may be a homeowner or the actual owner that is basically subsidizing, or you might say providing funding for a build. So really, it filters down to providing an overall price, which is the actual costing part. Typically, this is based on information on drawings, such as we see here, maybe not quite as detailed, and specific information when it comes to things such as the specifications. These both come together and are typically called the bidding or construction documents. That whole project will translate to a total dollar value of costs for any given project. So really, what's the difference? Well, is there really a big difference between the two? The combination of estimating and bidding is the primary way of getting work for most companies. So a cost estimate is a primary management tool and source of information regarding a specific project, such as building a house or perhaps the new community center. It is useful not just determining costs of the project, but also used for planning, scheduling, budgeting, and of course, hopefully cost control, and simply also really determining the final job costs. So we can look at it as they are different, but yet they somehow fit together. So again, in this particular slide, again, the source is from Managing Construction from Keith Collier. This is one of the textbooks I used in the college system for teaching students about estimating, and certainly project and construction management. I want to focus on those green circles, the estimating component. We can see sort of those, we'll call it sort of skin tone, beigey color, the planning cycle. And of course, when we talk about the management, sort of those yellowish circles, the controlling side of things. So those are the three main phases when it gets to estimating, planning, and controlling. But back to those green circles, you can see the first one talks about the cost data filing. We need cost information. And of course, fitting into the whole estimating package or trying to determine a cost for a project, we need to price out the quantities of work. And of course, we're going to look at that in a little more detail. So again, we can see in this, we'll call it circle, the estimating planning cycle circle, it should be a flow through, and we're going to deal with those first two green circles. So estimating is composed of reviewing cost data and from other work and resources. Pricing the quantities involve the actual takeoff, items of work, and calculation of the what is required, and determining the costs associated with that work. We will primarily focus on the two green circles, as I mentioned. A number of our future webinars will deal with the other parts of construction management cycle in more detail. So for example, in the future, you'll see I will be doing one on changes, the changes in work, or how do we control some of those costs? And what about things such as life cycle costing? So again, these all kind of fit into some of our sessions that will be future webinars. So really, what is it? So when we get to the what is it stage, estimates of cost can be simply basic or detailed. When we start taking a look at the detailed portion of it, we start thinking about things such as, is it going to be based on, or excuse me, the basic part of it is going to be based on an approximation. Some people call that the ballpark or preliminary or the rough estimate. As we can see here, the example of a new house can cost between $150 to $200 per square foot or more. Of course, this method does not provide details such as the quality of the materials, the size, or the shape, and other specific considerations. Elvis, you had a question you wanted to raise? Elvis might be muted there. Elvis, do you want to unmute?
It's cutting off on me.
I am cutting off.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you now and then.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's see if I can get that.
I don't know about anybody else, but I'm getting it.
Can everybody hear me?
I could hear you. Yeah, I could hear you now.
Okay, so maybe just to summarize or finish off this particular slide, when we take a look at it, as I mentioned earlier, we have the ballpark, or we'll call it the square footage pricing index, or we can go into the detailed. And when we get into the detailed, certainly it's a lot more work, as the name implies, detailed, but certainly the detail will give us a huge difference in more specific. So it doesn't lack the specific information such as size, shape, quality, and the types of materials. Next, okay. So what is the cost? So when we talk about cost, we want to talk about how can we best determine cost. So depending on the completeness rather of the documents, such as the drawings and specs, or specific information provided by the owner, it's difficult to reasonably and accurately determine costs. Estimating requires complete documentation to determine the standard, the quantity, and the quality of work, breaking it down into a system-based type of approach. It could be unit pricing the work, in consideration of certainly the specific general conditions required when it looks at the overall, how will the project be managed? What is required to complete the work? Of course, from the contractor or builder's perspective, we can't forget about their profit, their overhead costs to support and certainly recover the costs for doing the work. So the example provides us with one of many points. So we can see here when we talk about even the difference between vinyl siding or masonry, so a brick cladding on a house, the cost varies significantly. Getting back to what do you get per square foot, or what would you get if you did a more detailed estimate and figured out that certainly we can see here $4 a square foot versus $10 a square foot leaves a huge gap when we come to the actual cost of things. So when we start talking about as detailed what really is involved, so cost estimating is a process used to quantify cost, prices, and the resources required to deliver the project. So we kind of touched on that earlier. So as previously stated, it's the best performed in greater level of detail with due consideration of the direct and indirect costs. This can aid in determining not just the cost, but also what materials, labor, and equipment are required for any project. As an example, often labor costs can represent about 50% of the total cost of construction. That's a huge number. Thus, in some instances, a prefabricated house shipped to the site may very well be the most effective when it comes to cost and efficiency. But it really depends on what you're getting in that particular package for that house. You also have to remember that the overhead can also vary on, due to a number of other conditions, and we'll take a look at some of those shortly, such as it could range between 5%, or perhaps on some projects, we could mark it up to 20%. So again, a huge gap in the pricing. So what are the various types of estimates? So far, we've touched on two: detailed and what we could call the pretty much a ballpark type of, what some people like to call the guesstimate. Better yet, we could use a number of these systems. So for example, the area volume method, cost per square foot or cubic foot, or cubic yards or square yards. Subsystem assembly type, so a component method approach. So the functional units of assembly, for example, the foundations, the framing, electrical and flooring, and so on. A detailed quantity, so quantity and cost method of labor and materials, that would be itemized. Including indirect costs, certainly overhead, markup, and administrative, and certainly all those related job expenses. Or perhaps it's on a unit cost basis. Might apply to components such as $16 a lineal foot for strap, insulate, vapor barrier, drywall, and paint. So again, there are different types and methods to estimating. So what other factors affect costs? So when we start looking at this, other considerations must include a number of different conditions that must be factored into the overall costs, such as the ones listed here. We can see anything from legal to complexity, the quality of the documents and materials. How about the availability of skilled trades? And what about just sourcing out materials? Is it local, from a distance? Does it need to be shipped in? All of these have cost factors attached to them. Again, location of the project, construction schedule, the bidding environment. Is there expected to be lots of competition or no competition or very little competition? And of course, contingencies for the unforeseen. Again, building on a site is not always known what's beneath the ground or what type of concerns that the builder may run into. And are there any restrictions or other methods of work that might have to be employed rather than the builder's choice? So when we start taking a look at the estimation, we need to think about what does the estimator really need to know. So when we start taking a look at this, we can see here design information. So certainly starting with the bidding documents, drawings, and specs, having a thorough understanding of not only how to read them, interpret them, but also put into their mind exactly what is required for costing out and providing an estimate. Certainly there's the experiential, the person's experience. What training, experience, and consideration go into things such as past experience with past projects and works. Again, bidding on houses is not the same as bidding on a larger project, such as, let's say, an apartment building or a larger housing project. So again, various levels of experience. How about things about the estimator must have a thorough understanding about the measurement of work? Must be able to identify and describe the work, measure and determine the quantities of work, pricing the work. So this is where we get down to the cost, and summarizing the total cost for any given project. So again, these are skills necessary for a good estimator. What else does an estimator actually need to know? Well, when we break it down, you would have to determine how to be able to calculate dimensions or quantities, coming up with a description and or some type of coding system for the work. We'll talk about a little bit later, for example, the master format work items, or the pricing for the work and the measurement. And certainly a good understanding of building materials and certainly methods of construction. And thinking about things, as we know nowadays, how things are largely inflated. What about price increases? I know a number of even local home builders, a couple of them, my former students, have been saying, you know, now they build into their contracts for price increases. So again, what happens? They don't want to lose money. They certainly have to get the work completed, but who knows what the cost of a 2x4 will be tomorrow, or a sheet of plywood, as an example. Again, prices are fluctuating, and in some cases, quite dramatically. Well, let's take a look at this next page. We can see here. When we take a look at it, we can see this is one of the sheets I would use typically when I was doing estimating. So again, when we take a look at this, we need to consider the following estimate sheet. There are some essential pieces of information that should be considered for any type of estimate sheet or estimate process that you put together. So we talk about code or description in the very first column. So we can see here site layout, excavate. For example, we go down to concrete footings. We can see under concrete footings, under that category, a number of subheadings: footing forms, pad forms, stakes, rebar, tie wire, and so on. And we can see as we go across the top again, the quantity, the unit, or the measurements highlighted in yellow there, length, width, depth, or thickness. Well, determining the calculation. Well, what is going to be the cost for the material, the labor, what equipment might be involved, or is it simply pricing through a subcontractor? And then off to the far right side, a total. So again, this is my type of estimate sheet, and certainly there are a lot of other ways of doing this, but certainly just to kind of give us a general idea of what is required when performing an estimate. Again, we can see it. This is sheet number 1 of 12. There was going to be many sheets to this particular estimate, and certainly identifying the actual project. So again, when we start taking a look at things, we want to make sure that eventually it's extended out as a total for the item or component. On a large project, this can be numerous sheets, or on a simpler project, maybe just a few sheets. But one thing we can value is all of this information is useful, not just to the estimator for the estimate, but also beneficial to others. So for example, in the field, if they're successful in getting how much concrete's needed, how much formwork is needed, what needs to be delivered to the site, and so on. So again, just a piece of information there on just a general estimate sheet. We touched a little bit on master format, and master format is a basically a trademark formation. So when we look at CSI master format, the 26th version, we can see that there are a number of, we'll call it coding, that is applied to typical larger construction projects. So for example, procurement and contracting requirements, division 00. The specifications and general requirements, talked about general requirements, insurance, warranty, shop drawings, a number of different things that may be required. Certainly site facilities and services under division 1, general requirements, cleanup after the project, and so on. And we can see that facility construction subgroups. So what are the existing conditions, and going through on a division by division or section by section basis, a coding system. So again, concrete division 3, or carpentry would fall under division 6, wood, plastics, and composites, or insulation under division 7, thermal and moisture protection, and so on. So it's commonly used in government projects that often follow materials for specifications. So the specifications would also be talking about division 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, as it applies to a particular given project. Of course, we could always fall back to the more simplified solution. We can see here, if we consider the following estimate sheet, there are essential information that can be completed. So for example, we can put a code in. What was the estimated cost versus the actual costs? Again, this can be just simply a comparative method based on a system, very simplified system-based approach. Okay, so when we start moving on here, sorry about that, just need to get a gulp of water. Here's the more detailed version with a little more detail to it. Again, not the same as the earlier spreadsheet that I showed you for an estimate. Again, looking at it from another point of view, from another estimate. Some of the key things, again, code or description. In this case, we're going to be talking about the finished package for interior doors. And we can see there's a breakdown under the left-hand column, a number of different types of doors, the knobs, the door stops, the hinges, shims, and so on. Material, the quantity, the pieces, the unit costs, a subtotal. Again, the labor cost hasn't been completed on this particular estimate yet. Who's going to do the work? So you can see the contractor was going to be likely the band, and the rate. So the labor rate, and of course, over to the far right side, the total. So again, we can see here an example of a more detailed version of an estimate. Certainly when we get into more detailed version of an estimate, certainly as I indicated earlier, it's a lot more work. I wanted to point out there are a number of different ways to set up an estimate and costing sheet, such as this one or the one that you saw earlier. But the one I really prefer is simply by using the Microsoft Excel type spreadsheet. It has the ability to perform calculations using various formulas that you can build into each of those cells, those little areas, okay, where we can put in the information. And of course, estimating also requires certainly the costing overall for the project. So that could be totaled and summarized at the very end. But again, there are other computer-based estimating packages you can purchase out there. There are certainly some good ones out there, but from my point of view, they all tend to be very, very costly. We use one in the college system that we used to train our students on, but one of the downsides of it is there was a great big, almost 2-semester learning curve on how to get comfortable using it. So over, we'll say, 80 hours of, we'll call it study, in order to get comfortable with using an estimating package. If you're somewhat familiar with an Excel spreadsheet, it doesn't have to be really a tough, we'll call it learning curve to it. So let's talk about some general principles. As we can see, the estimator should have general knowledge of a house as a system, know how houses are built, certainly good math skills, knowledge of reading and interpreting drawings and specs, sources of information for pricing and costing, what equipment is required to perform certain items of work, and that's just to name a few. So when we start thinking about it, their list could grow, but it becomes pretty obvious that the estimator must have many skills and certainly abilities and certainly some knowledge and experience when it comes to costing out a build type project. Wanted to touch a little bit about resources. So we kind of touched on a little bit. The resources includes computerized estimating, can help in reducing the time and provide efficiencies. Use of cost codes helps in organizing and provide a universal checklist type system. And cost of handbooks can be helpful, or cost handbooks can be helpful, but often may not accurately reflect local costing. So for example, again, a few that we used to use in the field was RS Means, very, very good source book. National Construction Estimator, that's by Craftsman, a national publication company. But again, we have to look at the limitations. So again, we need to reference past work or certainly those of more recent projects to get a better idea of maybe where our price and costing should follow. Current pricing from past subtrades can also be another good source. So most simply provide, when we talk about those resources that you can buy, as far as RS Means in the construction estimator, they really provide an average cost and not necessarily factor in costs for each and every location, such as particularly your location, because it tends to really look at places like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or Winnipeg or Calgary, and not necessarily some of the more, we'll call it, distant locations. Let's take a look at another sample data. So after a project's been completed, we can use the sample cost data from past large house build. So maintaining and tracking previous costs can help in determining costs or predicting possible future costs. In the lower left corner, we can see, using the green arrow, okay, in that box, we can see a trade by trade breakdown. And the table above indicates the build costs plus the design and construction. So if we go immediately above that towards where the red arrow is, the hard costs, design, and the construction management. So again, the actual build costs. Well, what about designing and the construction management? And we can start to put those numbers back in use. Again, collecting data and information on what was the cost roughly per square foot to build this house. So we can see the hard cost was just shy of $160 a square foot. The cost to hire an architect or an engineer represented about $8 a square foot, or we can see an actual number there. Or on the construction side, the construction management side, how much per square foot. So again, if we use data, maybe not quite as complex as this, we can start to look at ways of collecting data and information from a past build. Again, this is just sort of a sample data, again, intended to give us some general idea of what we might expect for a future build of a house. Again, we have to also consider not all houses are the same, so there's going to be some variation, but at least we know on this type of house, by the way, this is more of a custom built home, that this would be on the data information that we could provide for a similar type of build. So what's the next step? Well, once we got the estimate together, usually I would have it checked by my boss or the owner of the company. And we would be probably submitting a bid. So we can see that primarily an estimate is required to determine the cost to build or complete a project. And typically construction projects are awarded to contractors with the lowest bid amount. That may be true in most cases, but not all cases. In fact, if we start looking at bidding documents and maybe some of the things such as general conditions, it may clearly spell out that maybe the lowest bid or any bid may not be accepted, or it may not be the lowest bid that is accepted. There could be a reason for going to the next lowest, well, the second best, we'll call it, price on a bid for a project for a number of reasons. We'll talk a little bit about more of that later in another course that we're going to be talking about a webinar on selecting, we'll call it, the bidder. So we start taking a look at this. We've seen so far estimators commonly use other resource tools. Most sources simply provide average costs, as I mentioned, such as larger cities. Again, they're simply useful guides. Certainly when it comes to estimates and accuracy, there must be it must be maintained in a continuous cost database. So the more we can build up our database of information, the easier it's going to become for the estimator to basically track and basically put costing in for any project. If again we want to look at, for example, some of those RS Mean books or the National Construction Estimator book, we could take a look at something such as pre-mixed concrete. So for example, in one book, it quotes a range between $290 to $350 per cubic yard, and in some cases even more. Well, we can see between $290 and $350, that's $60 a difference per cubic yard. And of course, so we start adding on other things to the concrete. For example, what's the strength of it? Is there formwork involved? Is there special finishing involved? Now we can see the prices can change dramatically. So again, when we're thinking about the bidding and estimating, there's a lot of things that have to be factored in from the estimators and costing point of view. Of course, the other thing is, what type of contract are we basically getting involved with? So that kind of brings us to the topic of the CCDC, Canadian Construction Document Committee, and basically looking at different types of contracts. Again, there are probably close to 20 different documents from the CCDC committee that we could use. I've picked out a few of the, we'll call it, typical ones. So for example, CCDC 2, stipulated price contract between the owner and the prime contractor. So again, this is a contract document when we start looking at estimating and costing between the owner and the, we'll call it, the builder or the major builder. And if we want, we can go into CCDC 2MA, master agreement between the owner and the contractor. That could be for ongoing construction and maintenance work. Or is it going to be a contract that's on a cost plus contract? So what is the actual cost the builder is going to charge, plus a percentage or a fixed fee applied to the actual costs? So I could submit a whole bunch of bills for a work to do a project, and I want 10%. That's my fixed fee applied on top of the actual costs. Or a unit price contract. How much does it cost for concrete to be brought to a community on an ongoing basis to be predetermined for a fixed specified amount? So again, you'll see there's a web link at the bottom if you wanted to take a look at some of the almost 20 different types of construction documents. Now, just kind of as kind of a caution, obviously these might tend to be a little heavy-handed for some smaller build communities. Again, a lot of these are based on large construction contracts that have been proven for decades of work, and they are periodically reviewed and updated. But probably, again, the most popular one is the CCDC, the stipulated price contract, where someone is asking for a bid, and this is the contract that would be existing between the owner and the builder. Again, you can use the information from these, and by the way, you have to purchase them. That's sort of the downside. But you could use the information from within these and basically create your own version for your contract type work. So we can see here, lump sum, unit price, cost plus fixed fee, cost plus fixed fee with a guaranteed maximum, cost plus an incentive. Get it done quick. The incentive will pay you a little bit more as a bonus. So again, there are various types of contracts. So again, all of these have an influence on the way a project is estimated and the way costs are derived for any given project. So I wanted to kind of break down, what about the traditional design bid build process? So we can see here, I've applied the CCDC stipulated price contract 2020. That's the current version, agreement between the owner and the contractor. So we can see over to the left-hand side, we can see I put in the red boxes some of the risk factors. So there's a design risk. So you might spend a lot of money designing a building for an owner that just simply doesn't go. Or for the look at it from the contractor's perspective, what risk is involved and why do I need a contract agreement between the owner and the contractor? So that's where the CCDC document comes in. Again, the consultant would be probably the architect, the engineer, or possibly in some cases another outside design consultant. Again, if we boil it down, we can see it's agreement between the owner and the contractor. And of course, there also would be a number of possible subcontractors that fall underneath of the main prime contractor. So for example, again, I've given you a few links here, OA standard form contractor. So that would be a standard form contract between a owner and an architect based on the Ontario Association of Architects standard form contract agreement. Or again, CCDC document outlet where you can actually purchase the CCDC documents for reference. Well, what are some of the key points when we look at the CCDC without getting into the multiple pages of what's in those particular agreements? So we can see here there's 13 major categories. General provisions. So for example, contract documents, law contract, rights and remedies, assignments, and so on. Under allowances, cash allowances, contingency allowance. And again, each of these have a number of subcategories, okay, or sections under them. So for example, we see, again, I'm going to be talking about changes in work. I'm going to be referring to the CCDC document and or in general, what happens when we see changes in a project. Well, we know changes in a project as an example, not too many times do the prices decrease, but in most cases, there seems to be a price increase. So again, just some general information. So again, uses of the information. The measurement of work provides a number of different benefits, such as cost estimates for bidding. We look at the bill of materials, great for ordering. So we can use that estimate sheet that's detailed. Create a bill of materials for ordering the concrete or the lumber and so on. For planning of the work activities, scheduling, and how much equipment's required or what equipment's required, and certainly again for scheduling. Again, if we own the equipment or they own the equipment is one thing, but if you've got to rent it, you probably want to minimize the rental times. Or what about the hiring of additional workers? Do you have the right number of people to do that type of work? Simply, there may be more required or specific types required. So again, all of these boil down to better management and control when we start to take a look at it from a project management perspective. And again, cost efficiencies. So let's kind of quickly summarize my session today. Again, there'll be more on the next one. Estimating is largely about mathematical calculations and knowledge of applying costs of measurement to work. Estimates come from calculating and pricing from the information. Costing generally needs consideration of conditions applicable to a specific project. As I mentioned, it could be many, many variables. Certainly overhead and administration costs are always included, typically included, be foolish not to be included. Actual job size has a bearing on costs, and bidding is based on competition as well as current supply and demands. So again, consistent, accurate estimating is a process that can involve risk. Guesswork should not be part of that process. Estimating and costing actually go sort of hand in hand. Both are critical parts of bidding, but also tracking results and helping in maintaining and certainly controlling costs. Floor is open for any comments or questions. John, you still there?
I am here still.
Okay, any comments, questions?
Well, we have a few. Rudy had one. Are you able to break down the estimates into their classes?
So what I'm saying to that is using the guide to cost predictability in construction. So we break down estimating in classes from class D to class A. There's a document out there that is really, really helpful. So why I bring that up is because when I do estimating for the bands, I'll use the class D, which is just a general overview. It might be the square footage of the building. There's not enough details yet. So as you go up in the classes from class D to A, you find that class A is pretty much what Claude is talking about, very detailed. You have the architectural information, you already have the property. You have a great deal of detailed information to make yourself an accurate construction estimate. So depending how you're dealing with individuals, we find often when you say in a conversation, somebody asks you, well, what do you think this is going to cost to have this built? So you're just, that's a guesstimate, which is pretty much what a class D estimate is. Your accuracy can be plus or minus as much as 50%. But as you move up in the classes, then you more details provided, such as from class D to class C. At that point, you may have the raw land, you may have a concept at hand, you may have a bit more details, whereas as you go up. So that's sort of where I'm moving with that stuff to add towards what Claude is saying in regards to the estimates. So there is definitely a document that has been produced by the federal government and Industry Cost Predictability Task Force that dates back to November of 2012. But it's what we use here in British Columbia for our gold seals. Gold seal site superintendents have to take the program, right? So just thought I'd let you know that.
Yeah, Rudy, I certainly agree with you, and I really didn't touch on that certainly in this particular, we'll say, portion of the webinar. But certainly that's something I was going to talk a little bit about. Is certainly the different classifications of we'll call it the estimate.
I apologize then for jumping the gun.
Oh no, not a problem, because I think again it's an important point to raise that people take a look at it. So when it comes, let's face it, costing and estimations, as I mentioned, we would teach at the college 2 semesters. So 2 semesters would equal 2 40-hour durations of just on estimating. And that's just training students how to do estimating. Certainly the first part was focusing on traditional, we'll call it the manual. We'll call it the, working it out on paper, as opposed to the second part was teaching them how to use software to do it a little more efficiently. But as I mentioned, certainly more detailed. And also you have to factor in a learning curve when it comes to often when we're dealing with software, right? So yeah, certainly those are important points, Rudy. So certainly well taken.
Sure.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Is there, like you broke down, let's say I want to build a fence. I quantify the materials, I picture the workers. I have 3 workers working on it. I'm going to pay them X amount of dollars, and they're going to take this many hours to do it. Where do I add overhead? And is there a breakdown of what is considered overhead? Like you'd had various matrix forms there. Like when I'm calculating my overhead, do I have what would I calculate in for an overhead amount? And the other one is, where do I put profit? Do I put profit on my workers as they're working, or do I just pay them that amount and at the end add a profit?
Again, a very good question. There's no real, we'll call it hard, fast answer to that question, but certainly maybe a couple of different perspectives. First off, when we talk about overhead, certainly that's something internally within the company. They would establish what the overhead would be. So for example, I said it could be 5% or upwards, maybe in some cases, if I can get away with it, to 20%. Depends on the size of the project. But also, I think what we need to think about is, if we sit there and break it down, what is required to pay me or pay the company for, let's say, the office, the administration, the lights, people in the office, the trucks, the equipment that are required to perform your work on a regular basis. So as an example, I worked with actually, 3 different general contractors. All of them did everything from housing into large commercial and residential and even industrial projects, schools, etc. And every project kind of differs. But certainly, getting back to your question about overhead, all those factors have to be built in. What does it cost to keep the lights on for your business, so to speak, or the heat for the business? To basically pay the bills at home, if you want to put it that way. The other part of it is that when we talk about overhead and markup, do we always need to, when we figure out an estimate, do we need to always mark up our sub-trades? Some do, some don't. Some will put a small, we'll call it, bump on that number. Others will just say, well, I'm just going to throw a little bit in just as a contingency because, let's say something might happen. So again, when we start looking at overhead and administration costs, we have to think about all the factors. And I think it gets back to kind of the beginning of your original comment. You really need to sit down and do a hard, fast list of everything you can think about that would go into that. The lights, the office, the truck, the insurance, and so on. All those things. And again, with working with a number of different builders, what are we'll say the productivity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about productivity in my next section, when we come to the actual workers. We know some people are really, really great workers. They're going to work their tail off to do a great job. And some of them will be, as we might call them, the slackers. How do you factor that in for even building a fence? There's going to be kind of hopefully a lead, some people that are willing to put in the time, and maybe, again, a different factor for, we'll call it the general laborers or the handy persons or people that might be just, I guess some people might call them the gopher. Go for the 2x4. I need some nails. So again, a lot of things can go into that when we start talking about that from a point of view of what are some of the administration and overhead costs. There's going to be a lot of variables there. And sometimes that is the difference between winning or not winning, being successful when it comes to bidding on projects. What are those numbers?
If I could add to that, Claude, you hit a very, very important word while you were summing this up: contingency. When I do the higher end estimates, I actually have a section in there that actually is the word contingency, and it may be 5%, 10%, or so on in addition to what the overall estimate is for the event that there are unforeseen circumstances, because things are fluid as they move along. The other thing is in regards to like your laborers, we generally use a burden. There is a burden involved to having workers, right? That would be your workman's compensation, your CPP, benefits they may have. These things you all have to put into your it might be just as simple as a fence, but you still have these burdens that you need to put in there. And so that usually is rolled into the hourly amount with your employees, right? So, or those working with you. But contingency is absolutely the key word nowadays we're using.
Yes, yes, great point.
My experience has been that when I'm bidding a job and I put in contingency, it's the owners, and generally I work with 100% First Nations. They do not want to see them out there. It adds to the budget, and there's always this thought that it's going to be used anyway. I mean, I'll invent something that I had missed and said, now I need to use the contingency. So all my experience.
That's a fair point. Definitely a fair point. But I think if you, and I find this in some of the jobs we do with the contingency, that is being a variable cost. Sometimes you come back after the job is completed and you find that we've used less of the percentage of the contingency than you were anticipating. And this becomes a feather in your cap, and it's something that you can move on. And, when people look at an estimate, you say, you could talk to my former client and so on. But the contingency I find is a safeguard. And, instead of hiding things and rolling it in there, it's probably best to be straight up front and say, this is what it's going to be. And if they don't like it, then move on to the next one.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point, because again, if you're the builder and the contingencies are built in, that's generally not going to be money that you're going to be returning back to your owner, unless it's something that is agreed upon.
Or a hard cost.
Exactly.
If
Or
it's a hard cost, then claim it right up front.
yeah, if it was an allowance amount in a contract that was specified that there's $10,000 in allowances, that's a little different, because under an agreement where there's allowances that are specified in, let's say, an amount such as 10,000, you would have to prove that there were expenses against the allowance. So there would be either a cost that basically is being tracked, or a credit being issued back to the owner saying, by the way, we only used 5 out of the $10,000, so therefore, you don't owe us that $5,000 of money that never came up under the allowance. So again, I can see where there can be an issue where, if it's really hard and fast, and let's say we get into the situation that sometimes obviously does happen, that let's say the project does go over budget, or the predicted estimated costs, where there could be cutbacks on things such as, well, do you really need that much money set in for contingencies or even for allowances? Can we cut a little bit of that? Or actually, I think, which might be being suggested here, is simply take it out. You just simply don't have that built-in flexibility. And really, that's what allowances and contingencies are about, is kind of the unforeseen conditions that sometimes we just don't know might happen, and actually in some cases certainly do happen.
So then in Al's case, then how do we proceed if you do an estimate and all of a sudden, you hit bedrock and you got to dig down further or whatever? Then you go back. So obviously your clause in your contract's got to allow for knowing you're going to come back with a contingency that's justified. So depending on your contract that you have, right? So it gets back to your legal document to say unexpected cost. It now is another, 15,000. correct?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, certainly, sometimes we don't know, and even with things such as soil tests, even if the soil test was conducted, I can use as an example, we did a seniors complex housing in southwestern Ontario, and you know, they were pouring for footings and they were digging, and when it came to um, towards the end of the workday, they hit basically a sinkhole. Well, they spent all night pouring concrete into that sinkhole, and that was something, number one, we as a contractor, and myself as the estimator, never counted on. And certainly the poor concrete company, you know, bring another load of concrete, you know, like truckfuls of concrete, premix. And they spent almost all night trying to fill this sinkhole. Where does that money come from? Well, fortunately, it was a provincial government project, a housing project that we were doing. And certainly they weren't too happy, but you can't blame the soil engineers that did the random testing on a site. And something that's going to, unfortunately, the government had to basically say, well, you know, this is extra costs there was no allowance for, and nobody thought about it as being one of the concerns that, in fact, it was one of the very first projects that I ever remember that we ran into conditions such as that, being a sinkhole on a construction site. So somebody's got to pay the piper, so to speak, for that concrete and the extra time and labor spent working all night on that particular condition.
Good point, Claude. I mean, that, you know, that example is a direct, a sort of a direct hidden cost. But, you know, to give an example there where we've all had to deal with here is the pandemic, right? You know, we've got projects going on, and all of a sudden the pandemic entered into and I think all of us have a story there where our costs jumped up because we lost, you know, workers, we couldn't get materials, and so on. And it's who is going to pay the burden? The burden has to be shifted onto the client, right? And of course, they're never happy about that. But there, you know, there's the direct and the indirects, and those indirects are the real surprisers, right?
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
Well,
Okay,
you've
go
done
ahead.
estimating. How much time, like as an estimator, I estimate residential, and I calculate the materials, and I picture the materials, I picture the workers installing them. I come up with a price. I have to now spend, when we win that contract, time with the workers to say, this is the material that is coming, this is the way you're going to install it, and this is the amount of time I will allow. And when you're building a house, it might be 20 meetings I have with them because it may change workers. You know, my deciders are different than my roofers, or my drywall guys are different than my siders. You know what I mean? So where do I build in my costs to explain what I've ordered or what I've pictured going to be built?
From my perspective, it falls back under that, and we'll call it project administration. Again, it's going to be one of those built-in factors of do I charge an extra 1% above the total cost of the project for all those meetings, all those setups. Uh, as you likely know, when we start looking at the successful builder or contractor, simply has to expedite material. So somebody has to do the expediting and figure out how many 2x4s or sheets of lumber or yards of concrete are required for a particular project. And also, we should have a general idea as an estimator how much rough time has been allocated to do that particular part of the work. So again, it's not really rocket science per se, because we know things can change in depending on the actual crew or work crew and their capabilities. But typically, you know, I could say, for example, our guy that did all our digging and excavating and backhoe work, we knew kind of what his productivity was. and typically what he could do under normal conditions. But what happens when they run into, let's say, buried things that you don't expect? So certainly there are conditions that you have to factor in, some plus and some minuses, but certainly have a general idea of what is probably normal for that particular, we'll say, project or situation. So again, some of it is simply we don't know. And sometimes we might be lucky enough to say, well, that was extra burden or extra work that was required to do that part that was unexpected, that is outside, that falls out sort of outside of the scope of work that was anticipated for this particular project. And hopefully you get an extra for it. I can also share another story with you. I did some work. There was a local millwork company in my area, and they actually bid on a project, and I did some site work for them. And one of my, I guess, tasks for this company was to read the drawings and specs and look for the errors. So it was a hired hitman basically looking for problems on a project where they could bid low and go in and just charge like tomorrow for extras.
Those are the change orders?
Yeah, the change orders.
Yeah.
Okay, so
We call that nasty word spiking. You go in and then spike the job later. But to add to that, comment, I find, again, that the adding in for a project manager, depending the size of the project, right? I find that one of the most frustrating things out there. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I tell you, one project I can go 5 times, another project I wind up going 25 times, right? And you just you kind of think to yourself sometimes, how did this happen? And then the next project you want to be, you're gun shy, and you say, okay, well, I'm gonna hit it with 25 times, and then you lose the bid.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, when we start talking about like costing and estimating, certainly there are companies out there that want to lowball a project, get a lot of work, and hopefully find out that they can make a lot of money on change orders and things that were mistakes on drawings. It does happen, and certainly if you can be successful doing that. In the case of the company that I was looking at, the typical was not typical when it came to the drawing note on a particular set of drawings. And that was for a government project. And there was actually, I think one of the changes involved close to $1 million worth of extras. Now, I'm sure the government wasn't too happy about that. But anyway,
Yeah, I just follow up on the comments. One was for the north, estimating ice roads and whether or not how long they're open for moving product for the north is a huge issue.
mm-hmm.
And I think, okay, I turned that off. And then Jessica mentioned, yeah, IS doesn't like the word contingency. Yeah, which I know I myself tender, and they don't like contingency. I just, for me, when I tender, I just whack it in as a per diem cost and as a professional fee. So if I'm billing, 20, 15 is the actual, I'll figure 2 on a mid, 1 for a contingency. So I build it in as my time. It's crazy.
Well, sometimes you don't know, and hey, John, we know sometimes on a project you can have a project manager as a project manager from where, from Hades.
Yeah.
So it some go smooth, and some, as was mentioned, you can keep an eye on a project 5 times to visit the site and manage, or 25 times, and that has a huge impact on, again, costs and profitability.
Yeah. All right. If there's nothing further, we continue on Thursday.
More on Thursday. Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks, everyone. I'm recording off.
Take care.